Good morning. It's July 26th, 2026. Well, the smoke is still here, and I'm just waking up, and I'm trying to be as nonchalant as I can and do what I can with what I've written down. So, anyway, a lot of times when I go and I'm bored, I'll go on TikTok, and I find it's really interesting to listen to young Indigenous activists, Indigenous women and men. And so there are two podcasts that from this lady who I think really helps self-educate or helps us as Indigenous people identify, especially what it means to be an Indigenous woman. There's a little bit of a bias, like I try not to put too much emphasis on cultural differences, but I do realize there is some sort of manifestation in our political view, especially being colonized, in terms of how under the Indian Act we've constructed some biases when it comes to women who marry into our communities, or just the women who do marry, how much they bully and really manipulate. I know that's biased. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that throughout my life here, most of the women who've run for politics are women who've married in. I don't know, just this past election, 5 of the women, I think it's 5 or 6 of the women actually grew up here that have been voted in. So there are changes happening, and I'm grateful. But at the same time, too, a lot of this colonized way of thinking, we really have to take a look at. Well, for me, I take a look at it and ask myself, how has the Indian Act affected me, especially when it comes to the trafficking of our children. And sometimes we don't even understand what it is to be trafficked. And again, this is my own bias because I've never been married or have children or even lived with a partner. So what makes me an expert? Well, I'm not an expert. That's what I'm trying to say. But I do know that if I had somehow decided to be in a relationship, it would have been really strained because, again, of the lateral violence and the misogyny. People, especially women from other communities who marry in, have against the women who grow up in the communities that their partners live in. I don't know if it has to do with insecurity or what, but the majority of times too, because a lot of the places that, like for Tsuut'ina, we're right by a city, so a lot of the things that I've become used to, a lot of non-Indigenous, non-Indigenous, a lot of Indigenous men say that I'm a princess. And I'm going, what do you mean? Because I take offense when somebody says, oh, you're a princess. Well, because I'm only 5 minutes from Tim Hortons or movie theaters or even the hospital or the malls. And so I grew up that way. I grew up playing hooky from my school to go to a shopping mall or hang out in the downtown parkade just to skip out of school. So my life, how I grew up around white people, is different than, say, women who lived their whole life in an isolated northern community or southern community, and they marry into Tsuut'ina. Again, too, during the Stampede, my cousins and I, when we'd go partying in the city, we'd say we'd see once a year Indians, once a year Indigenous people, because it's just a ritual thing growing up that there weren't that many Indigenous people actually living in the city. Now today there's 40,000 Indigenous people. So again, I'm talking about generational and gaps in how people perceive what it is to be Indigenous. But in historical sense, though, a lot of times because you're growing up in poverty, say, for example, maybe 30 years ago, maybe a little less, my late brother, he married. I came up from the United States to witness his wedding, and to my surprise, the community where he his partner was from, there were a lot of teenagers, like children having children. I couldn't believe it, but yet at the same time, even in the past 20 years, and when I talk to women in my community who have partners who come from northern communities, and I talk about trafficking, it's the whole concept of parents marrying off their daughters when they're like 15 and 16. Now, historically, here in Tsuut'ina too, there have been quite a few child brides. And I say child brides because like what your body still isn't fully developed to even be you have sexual arousal, but the whole enjoyment of human sexuality isn't really set in place until your body is mature. Now again, I might be just redundant and repeating something you already know, but what I'm trying to say is the whole concept of trafficking, when you're so poor that you cannot look after your daughters or even afford to help them, like save money and help them get into university or high school. And so when they become sexually active, they marry them out. So they leave their communities to another community. And when you're that young, coming into a foreign community, then how do you adjust to that? Because in a way, it's a form of trafficking. Because like you're still a child. That's how I think it's been normalized. But there's also some other complications involved with the Indian Act and how the Indian Act treated and handled Indigenous women in terms of like property and what is a status or non-status, and just the whole racial bias created when a woman gets pregnant. Like that's hard to understand. But again, too, I think a lot of white women sort of feel like they have some sort of moral obligation to say, well, this is how my life is. Your sexuality is no different than mine. I was promiscuous. I did this and that. And I'm going, yes, that's the human experience. But there is a difference in terms of decolonizing oneself and the fact that a lot of the concepts of who we are as Indigenous women is played out by the greater society. So it's no biggie when I have a friend who's 75 and says, yeah, these cowboys, they sure like Indian girls. Hey, what can I say? That's just the way things are. People from other countries see other women as exotic. But again, too, what are the boundaries, and who's responsible for putting these boundaries up? So I just got off the phone with my cousin, and she's Indigenous, and I was talking to her. I said, some friends, they come and they go, and she said, well, Marina, that's life. And I said, yes. I said, right until the bitter end, when we take our last breath, there's not going to be. It's just the way it is. We make friends, and then that we go our separate ways. And so, I was saying that to her. I said, my whole life, I've been around white women, and sometimes it's the hypocrisy or the projection of privilege. I made a comment. I said, it's really difficult for me to accept white women and white men as mental health workers that come into our communities, especially when they have a preconceived notion of what it's like to live in our communities, when really their only reference point is from point of privilege. And my goodness, how dare an Indigenous woman do a critique on you when, there's a bias right there. So that's why when I talk about sexuality and identity, even though we're the same gender, the colonial construct created under the Indian Act and how people have lived that way, like in a conscious way, without even understanding that this is what they're doing, this shadow effect of how women marry into our communities. It's a psychological thing of privilege in some ways, because they're basically mansplaining to Indigenous women, this is what you do, this is how you. It's like basically, I'm making fun because this is so real. I've seen it, I've witnessed it. I've had white women say, this is how you do this. Or this is, don't throw water on the ground, or give out these gifts, these free gifts in the sacred directions. Like, where did they learn this bullshit? And why do they think it's so beneath them to like, understand, like, you're talking to an Indigenous woman who's grown up around spirituality or Indigenous spirituality, and here you are coming in, latching on to somebody who's Indigenous, having sex with them and living with them and thinking, okay, therefore I know I have knowledge because I respect my partner. No, it doesn't work that way. That's for white women. But the majority of times too, when I talk about women marrying into my community, these are Indigenous women, because again, it has to bring that mindset of like what it is that they're bringing into our community. And studies have shown that too. Like, most of the time, uneducated attract uneducated, educated attract educated, wealthy attracts wealthy, etc. But the reality of it is that that there is some nonsense that has been handed down from the Indian agent about how Indigenous men should treat the women in their families. The Indian agent always took Indians as property, and even in terms of, I use the example of Britney Spears and how she became her parents became guardian. Well, that's how the federal government is towards us when it comes to Crown land and our trust fund. So anyway, this young woman, she's talking about this bill, Bill C-2, a bill that started in the Senate and needs to be passed for any of these changes to become law. Now, this is a really brilliant young woman. So she puts it that simply Bill S-2 is proposed legislation that would seek amendments to the Indian Act. So you have to understand, every time that Indian Act has been in place and every change to it has to go through this process, even for to change the status of Indigenous women. From the time that they would marry non-Indigenous or non-status, they would lose everything. So if they were matriarch, all of a sudden, just through having a different partner from a different culture, the federal government took away your identity as an Indigenous person. You were no longer considered Indigenous. However, it worked the opposite for our men. They could marry a white woman, and automatically she would inherit this Indigenous woman status. Blonde, blue-eyed, she's an Indigenous woman. The courts would defend her up and down, so she had double privilege. So, yeah, the bias on that still lingers, even in the sense of like when women marry, Indigenous women marry within the community, because they feel like their status has improved because they're not from the community, like a white woman who marries within. There's a certain privilege that the federal government has recognized. And again, at whose fault? At the fault of the Indigenous women like myself who've grown up here my entire life. So this young woman says she's seeing a lot of people that think are confused about this and think that the government just wants to open the floodgates and a bunch of pretendians are going to come into the woodwork. But that's not really what's going to happen, she says. Essentially, it's restoring what was lost, more specifically to women and their descendants because of the sexist and colonial policies. See, that's what I'm talking about. Like when I say I have white uncles, it's because of this policy, this colonial sexist policy. And some other changes that are being proposed, she says, are things like changing the outdated language, because right now under the Indian Act, Indigenous people with disabilities are referred to as mentally incompetent Indians. Okay, so even that, I mean, like, okay, for newcomers, immigrants, white people, black people, like really, this Indian Act governs how leadership identifies band members, Indigenous, like First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Now, understand this too. Only the past 2 years has the federal government acknowledged Indigenous status of the I think it's 9 Sioux tribes in Canada, as well as the Inuit and Métis in Canada. Only 2 years ago. So that means like my mom and my aunties and my grandparents, who are Dakota Sioux, weren't recognized as Indigenous people until 2 years ago. So even though they're sitting on Crown land and they have reserves or Métis settlements or Inuit settlements, they still were not considered Indigenous until 2 years ago. So you have to understand the practice, the systemic racist practice of who was defined as being Indigenous. Now, she says that they want change that they want to change that to dependent persons, just the identity of like that they're mentally incompetent Indians to just dependent person, and it would also create things like a very clear process for people that want their names removed from the Indian registry. So essentially, removing yourself from being certified as an Indian status. And another thing is that it would do is to see people that are newly eligible for status also be eligible to be added to the banned list. Because in Canada, if you are a First Nations person that belongs to a nation that is under the Indian Act, the federal government actually maintains those lists. So that's why, like, even when my sister married a Navajo, she lost her status because in Canada we don't recognize Native Americans from the United States. So any Indigenous woman who married a Native American from the United States, she would lose her status as well. Now, again, that's federal policy. So when the Indian Act was changed, so women who were allowed to marry whoever they wanted that didn't have status, they'd still remain Indigenous under the Indian Act. And they were put on a general ban list in Ottawa. So this is what this young woman is talking about. Even though they're going to change this bill, it's a process. And throughout the decades that I've talked to Indigenous people whose grandmothers or mothers are Indigenous, I've said, keep a record. Keep marriage records, birth certificates, everything. I said, because the status is going to change, and when it does, you need to have those records, because even you're put on the general list in Ottawa, the application for an individual to become a band member is based on the band membership codes that each tribe created for themselves. Like with the Dakota Sioux, they automatically just accepted everybody, because again, they weren't even considered Indigenous until 2 years ago. So every way and every which way people have tried to erase Indigenous ways of knowing or the culture has been part of this Indian Act. And no matter how much people say, oh, well, I get it. No, you really don't, because you've never lived it. So again, in both, or this young woman is saying, both in the House of Commons and the Senate, as long as it doesn't spend taxpayers' dollars, which is how it originated in the Senate, it already passed first reading and second reading. And now it's in the consideration in committee. Senate and House of Commons committees are a very important part of the process, because places like committees is where these amendments were made and voted on. So here's where it gets interesting. This is her saying this. This bill needs to go through the House of Commons, and it needs to be passed through the House of Commons. But if the House of Commons decides that they also want to make amendments to this bill, it needs to be sent back to the Senate to either reject or approve those amendments. And then what has to happen is the House of Commons and the Senate both need to pass the same version of the bill. And then it receives royal assent and becomes law. And then these changes take effect. So throughout the patriarchy and the matriarchy struggle of balance, this whole process of going through the House of Commons, the Senate, the readings, and going back and forth to make it law is so time consuming and so structured. I use the analogy, it's like a sexual assault victim, and how, the victim has to document everything, and the investigators, investigate her. Then it's got to go to the judge, and then they, whether or not it's a case. Then if it's a case, then they got to arrest the person. The whole judicial process under Court of King's Bench is the same in terms of legislation, and even changing parts of the Indian Act that was so discriminatory and still is discriminatory towards Indigenous women and and children. Okay, so she says it's a very condensed version of what Bill S2 is. And no, it does not open the floodgates, and it does not make a bunch of people Indigenous. Essentially, what it does is address the fact that people were removed or forced out of their legal status was because of discriminatory policies. So this discriminatory policies, as redundant as some people might think it is, has had a total impact on how Indigenous women see other Indigenous women. Or even when Indigenous women marry into communities that are culturally different than them, that have totally different band membership policies, all this is an orientation or oriented to the woman coming into the community. Because the prejudice is that for me as an Indigenous woman, I cannot bring a man into my community, which is, again, discriminatory. And because of that, I don't have status. And even my children wouldn't have status because of the Indian Act and the representation of it. So I jokingly say, well, I have white uncles. Again, the majority of my white uncles are married to Dakota women, which again, until 2 years ago, weren't even considered Indigenous. So there is a lot of expectation when it comes to like who is Indigenous and how traditional are you? Like really, that's what it's. They do. They bring in spirituality to this whole equation, and that's why, like for me, as an Indigenous woman, I don't claim to be a spiritual healer, nothing like that, because I've seen it play out in our Indigenous men with their women that they brought into the communities. So this woman says, for example, a lot of women in my community, this is what I'm saying, like they've lost their status, and the whole fact is that when you have misogyny and lateral violence, it comes to the identity of Indigenous woman. It attacks the identity of an Indigenous woman. So the ideology of the colonial way of thinking is that a woman's is a piece of property, and therefore her children are also a commodity and can be pushed around and moved around. And see, that's where the discriminatory part of the child welfare system comes in, because we don't have sovereignty over that, because we as Indigenous women do not have sovereignty under the Indian Act. And so therefore, if we try to have group homes or shelters for our children in our communities, we can't do that because it's under the Indian Act. And so, like, in order to change that, we have to have educated Indigenous people in those areas to develop the policies, because eventually those policies will be taken over by local government, much like the education policy was taken over. And even then it was a struggle, and still is a struggle, in how the tripart agreements are being held between the federal and provincial judiciary process, or the fiduciary obligations that are passed down through treaty. Treaty, treaty. That's why I'm saying it's a source of, it's a catalyst to trafficking. Now, like my concerns, and the thing about it is, like, when women choose to be single and have children, the majority of the women don't get housing, or they're at the bottom of the economic spectrum. And so in order to have sort of like that this disparity is that if you grew up here and you decided to have not be married and just keep your status, all your children would have your name, your maiden name. They won't have their father's name. And at the same time too, even if you applied for a home, you don't have a partner because you chose to not be with a partner because there'd be some disparity in how band funds are allocated to you. So if you're an Indigenous man and you marry an Indigenous woman or white woman, and they're in the community, then all of a sudden you can apply for a house and you could get it, even if you don't have children. And again, this is discriminatory towards women who choose to be single mothers. Or even if you're a teenage pregnancy, anything where it has to do with women trying to take care of their children, their babies. And then again, because of this disparity of poverty, the woman is looked at as like incompetent or basically like what they called like for disabilities, how they treat, in the Indian Act, how they treat people with disabilities. Well, that's the same parallel in how they treat Indigenous women who've grown up within their communities. And again, this is my opinion because I've seen it, I've grown it, I've smelled it, I've tasted it, I've thrown up. Anyway, so the sooner a girl is married off, the better off it is for her to actually get a home and have like a male, somebody who owns her and her children. And again, it's sort of self-defeating when it comes to like the disparity, because then they look at women who've grown up here and wonder, well, why do you have such self-defeating behavior? When look at me, I'm from a poor community, I've got all this culture and you're just so culturally deprived. I mean, it's my opinion. Because lateral violence, where did it start from, and why do women who marry in, or why? And this is my own personal opinion, but you can ask any woman who's grown up in their First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. You ask them, like women who marry in, are they friend or foe? And that's the reality of our policies that are made in terms of housing. Who gets housing? Who gets certain perks for just living in the community? So the more a man is perceived as being like the breadwinner, or the more, again, because of colonial constructs. So again, if you marry a white man and your status has improved because they just think, oh, well, he's your provider. But again, too, they neglect to understand the cultural facet of it is that you lose your maternal support system that you grew up with. And so, I'll use an example. There was a young woman who was staying with her uncle and aunt, and the aunt had married in. And the aunt was trained by colonial Indian agent to be an office administrator. And because of that, she worked, and the man that she married was a farmer, mechanic, jack of all trades. And she was collecting, like she had a babysitter, one of her partner's relative, without the partner knowing what his Indigenous wife was doing. She was collecting social assistance for the babysitter, but as well as not paying the babysitter for babysitting and taking care of their children. So that kind of, we'll call it narcissism or Machiavellian ways of thinking for women who've married in, thinking that, I've got to try and get the best out of my situation here because look at my partner. That in itself is very, it's the reality of women being so cruel to other women and yet, you wonder, where did they get that from? And like I said, this woman who married in, she's a survivor of Indian residential school, and also denying that she has any historical trauma, as she notably says that was in the past. But the reality of it is that you still see it in how scared her excuse me, her daughters are of her because her partner had passed away. So there are so many things. There's so many things that excuse me, when I'm growing up here in Sutana, and you're on this healing journey, trying to understand who you are and why things are done, or policies made to keep you in your place. Like I said, doing the first daycare, the first detox, just so I could have a place to stay, rather than going into the city and paying rent. I was in my early 20s. So this is a reality. This is my reality. This is my opinion. And again, to the policies that anybody under the age of 55 who was single and had no children could not apply for housing. Because again, you got to look at it historically as well as the reality of today. The majority of women, more than 50%, are the main administrators, the main, like doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs. And yet, unless you're a chief, a female chief, you don't have a voice at the national, like at the AFN. So this discriminatory policy goes right through the whole system, and then we have our men wondering, what is the matter with our women? Well, the audacity of the fact that for years, you're okay to bring in women, but not honor the women, your sisters, your mothers, your aunts, who actually grew up in the community. That's why I think things are changing, because the majority of our young counselors are women who've actually grown up here. And again, too, like it's not like easy. You take on this political role and you're going to get criticized, and you have to take it. You have to. You can't be going around, just putting stuff on Facebook and social media and crying and saying, "How dare you do this and that?" And it's time to like sort of, what do they say, smarten up, buttercup. Anyway, there's so much violence that happens within homes, and then people, like, how do you help? How do you help people who are victims of violence when they don't want help? Now, the basic psychology of it is like when somebody overdoses in the city and they're laying semi-conscious on the ground, and the ambulance and the fire department come, and the person gets up and they say, "Well, do you need help?" And they say no. Then they walk away. The person could overdose, but they denied help. Well, it's the same thing with violence. When I've seen women being beaten up in public, and I go and tell the husband to leave her alone, then I'm attacked by the wife to tell me to stay out of her business. Because she's being beaten. I mean, the laws have changed now, so they found out that at least a year or so after the violence has occurred, then a woman sort of gets this epiphany, like, oh, this is injustice. So now they protect the victims of violence, like women and men who are victims of violence. But again, too, it makes policing all the more at risk when you go into family violence situations where the woman's trying to defend herself and yet at the same time protect her partner. She can turn on the person who's rescuing her. Okay, so again, that's why, like, when it comes to people who hearsay about sexual violence, and they say, "Oh, this woman was drunk and this leader took her into her hotel room," and I'm going, but you took a video of her being drunk. why didn't you go up to her and say, let's have a coffee? Or, why didn't you talk to this alleged victim? And again, it's the victim isn't telling the story. It's the woman who watched the woman behave in a certain manner, that she's putting judgment on the man, but yet it's the victim. If she actually, again, that's why I state, if you're going to press charges, it's got to come from the victim. You can't be like it's like me. If I see somebody being beaten up and I go and I tell the guys, don't beat your wife, and she says, leave us alone, I have to walk away. If a man's overdosing and I say, well, I'm getting help, and he says, no, I don't want help, I have to go away. So, that's why I'm saying it's one thing to call wolf and think that you're doing justice by advocating against violence. It's another thing to be the victim and to realize, like, the victim has to make the statement. It's the victim who has to say, this person hurt me. Nobody else can do it. So that's why I caution people, be careful. Be careful of how you're mansplaining things on behalf that you think on behalf of all women, when really it's the victim that you haven't talked with. So, and the majority of times too, even like when you deal with personally, just my opinion is that my dealing with my life and how I manage or don't manage boundaries, that's my responsibility. That's my journey in this life. And as old as I am, as an elder, I'm constantly learning these things. It's amazing to me that it's important that, I don't want to make it sound like I'm so codependent, but there is a dance of intimacy where the man has, he puts down the boundaries. And as the woman, you're understanding those boundaries. But it should be the same thing, too, with women and other women. When you're talking, as women, we need to put boundaries down with other women. I find more so with Indigenous women, when it comes to white women or other women, that we do not put boundaries down with other women when we need to. Because, that's the lesson that men have taught me. And not like physically saying, like a teacher sitting me down and showing me the ABCs. It has to do with how I understand my own sexuality and to understand, like, when a man is comfortable or uncomfortable. It's the same thing in any relationship, male or female. Boundaries are important because some people, when they don't have those in place, they take offense when you start putting boundaries down, and you're wondering what changed. Well, say for example, for me, my attitude has changed. I'm really grateful that I was taught this by a man about boundaries. It's not like I just learned it. It's a validation. I guess that's the proper way of putting it. Throughout my life, the validation of boundaries when talking to men is vital, but it should also take another step forward when it comes to women as well, because we are responsible as women to look after our own mental health. And so that's part of what I wanted to talk about with my podcast, because it's a bit discerning or concerning in the sense that, throughout my life I've had to walk away from friends, people that I get close to, and then something happens and I just realize, okay, the boundaries have been crossed. Either I crossed them or they crossed me, and that's just the way it is. So we walk away from people. So anyway, this woman who's talking about Bill S2, when she says it's like, what is status? Once you get your status, you have to you're put on the general list, and then once you're put on the list, then you have to go the protocols of what it is you need to get voted on. So even though you're on the general list in Ottawa, you still have to be voted on as an actual tribal member, either in First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. And all and every Indigenous person, I don't care how much lies or mansplaining from pretendians, there is a paper trail with both First Nations, Inuit, and Métis right back to the land. There's no getting around it. And if when this Bill S2 passes and you have all your documentation, you'll get put on the general ban list in Ottawa. However, you need to go to your original place where your grandmother or your mother or somebody lost their status because they were women. You need to make application to be voted back into the general, like the actual list where you can vote for people for your chief and council. It's been here for a couple of decades in my community, and it's been noted that we needed time to figure these things out for ourselves. A lot of other tribes, like I said, with the Sioux, they just automatically accepted everybody back because they weren't recognized as Indigenous people in Canada until 2 years ago. So even Inuit and Métis. So for all those people who are pretending or think that they're Indigenous, smarten up, buttercups. If you have those records, you'll be put on the general list in Ottawa. However, if you've got enough courage to actually make application to be on belong to a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities, you have to apply to the local leadership. And if you have relatives who live in those communities, then you have nothing to fear. And if you've been able to advocate for those communities and those communities know you, then you have no problem in being voted on. So that's the gist of it. If you, like I said, there's just so much in terms of matriarchy in Western Canada, and just how things uncovered when it came to those Indian residential schools dissolving. Because you got to understand the historical context of it is that Alberta had more Indian residential schools because of oil. A lot of the human trafficking and all the disruptions in terms of even trying to get monies out of the province or the federal government's fiduciary obligation under the treaties, they've been trying to pass it off to the province. And that's why you have this lawsuit with this recovery center, because it was the way of Danielle Smith passing off federal dollars that would come in from Ottawa to the province and siphoning it to First Nations, when really it's a fiduciary obligation from the federal government. Now, all this stuff, this paperwork and this trail of lawyers all understanding what's been happening is cause for concern, and it's cause for concern for Indigenous people, because all the work and the effort to heal and have people understand what it is to go through the healing process has been erased by separatists or people who don't understand the Indian Act or don't understand the history of Canada or even the history of Alberta or even the history of Calgary. So the importance of why you are who you are and why the government is the way it is today is all a result of the colonial constructs called the Indian Act, which is a discriminatory bill trying to erase the status of Indigenous people through the exploitation of Indigenous women and their children, which again is a fiduciary obligation to protect women and children by the federal government, which has failed miserably. And again, they projected onto First Nations as being inappropriate, that we don't know what the hell we're doing, because again, all they have to do is refer to the Indian Act because it's law. So for Indigenous people to just change a law, this young woman has explained the process that you have to go through. And even then, when they want to put a wrench in it, it goes back in for an amendment. And it takes years to change. So we're born into this systemic racist system. And the more young people understand, like the origin of the Indian Act, or the treaties first, Indian Act, Indian industrial schools, Indian residential schools, That's all grooming. It's all grooming. And again, how well are we groomed? If we can't even step back and look and say, oh, there were no boundaries. I didn't know this. Yes, you can only plead ignorance for a certain amount of time. Then after that, who's accountable? And it may seem confusing to some people, but that's the reality of what I've been born into. That's why when I say matriarchy, you have to be born into it. You live it, you breathe it, you taste it, you smell it. And for the life of me, all the women who've come before me and are going to be here even after I'm gone are still going to try and help better this structure, this law. Yes, you have provincial law, you have federal laws that non-Indigenous people and immigrants follow, but our law is under the Indian Act. And like this one young man, says, we're fighting against the oldest monarchy in the world, one of the older monarchies in the world. And on top of that, too, like the federal government has hundreds, thousands of lawyers. So, right off the bat, we're trying to educate our young people and understand the systemic racism that has come and perpetrated its way from the conquering and the exploitation of Native Americans, United States, it coming into Canada through oil money, just to take land, and like again, under the King of England right now, we're under treaty, which is different than Native Americans. So when you have Danielle Smith and these separatist people and even immigrants who come in from the United States or think American, no, we're not Americans. We're a colonial construct with a king and a former queen, all from the time of the fur traders, all that stuff. Because at one time Britain was a superpower. At one time the United States was a superpower, and I think it's really difficult for we'll say white people or people who are colonialized or part of the settler state for to get the reality that the regime has changed. The policies and procedures and the laws of each government has changed. And just in the United States, it's based on a president. One man. Like they say the Constitution and all this, the Senate and all that, okay? But in Canada, we have a king based on treaties and all this stuff. Do you know the United States' first treaty? The United States, when it became a country, the first treaty that they made was called the Jay Treaty. And that gave rights to Indigenous people from Canada to travel into the United States and live there. That's called the Jay Treaty. So when you're talking about breaking away and separating, who has more eligibility? It sure isn't colonizers. It's the Indigenous people of the Americas, also validated in the Jay Treaty of the United States. And then from there we've got treaties 1, 2, 3, and we go on in Canada. Native American people do not have treaty. They don't. They have elected officials that, for some reason, out of the blue, like maybe they live to be 50 or 40 or 70. And just those couple of decades, they changed the way people think and how they understand things, because there's no reference for the people that came before them. I said, well, those settlers, scalping Indians, like, all this stuff that I talk about in terms of my podcast and the genocide, well, we're not responsible, they say. But yes, you're responsible now. You're responsible to take a look at who is doing what and to what people. I'm just really the indifference of people towards people who've actually, their bloodline comes from the Americas. So with that, I don't think people get a total grasp of exactly what country they're living in or the history of the Americas, because it's been erased by capitalists' ways of thinking. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, that there's this legacy of people having laws or policies and how discriminatory they are in terms of fascism. Now that's for non-Indigenous women, who like white women or other women of color who do not fall under the Indian Act, or like are not Indigenous. That means Métis, Inuit, or First Nations. There's fascism, and that's the closest I can get to what the Indian Act is. But when you're afraid and you're saying, oh, they're going to change the way how women are, and what their rights are, that's scary. And yes, as an Indigenous woman, like, welcome to the club. But if it offends you that I say that, and you think I'm not putting some boundaries down and saying, no, I know I'm different. And if it offends you, then that's not my problem. But like I said, my whole life I've made friends and I've had to walk away from them. And I think the greatest lesson I've learned in terms of culture, or just the differences within each of us as human beings, is our inability to put boundaries down. Now, the greatest gift as a human being can give to another human being is to state your boundaries. To let the other person know how you feel, what you're capable of doing or not doing, what you're capable of participating in and what you're not capable of participating in. Putting boundaries down, letting them know, because in the long run of it, in my opinion, it's a blessing. For me, I get joy out of it, that I've been respected in such a way that boundaries were put in place for me, guiding me to understand that individual better. And again, for me, just being so me. Again, I'm not pleading ignorance. I'm just saying I've had to walk away from friendships. Again, because I just not assumed, but it's the reality. It's the reality that sometimes some people really are just think so highly of themselves. Like, it's so historical, even though they apologize and they say, yeah, this is systemic and all this. The reality of it is that, when it comes to being offended and I offend you, then why did you want my opinion? Or why did it offend you in the first place? See, for me, when I was talking to a person who was putting boundaries down, they said, I can take care of myself. See, that's all this other individual had to say in order for me to not continue with my opinion. But they didn't. And because of that, they weren't practicing their boundaries. And because they weren't practicing their boundaries, I got to see a really nasty part of them. Which is okay. It's just that I have to grieve over that. It's not like grieving isn't new to me. And again, too, like I said, right until the very bitter end, until I'm 6 feet underground, I will be practicing boundaries and hoping that I don't have to walk away from someone that I had hoped would be a lifetime friend. And again, too, by the time you're my age, you get a small handful of people will always be there through thick and thin, and have known me since I was a child. It's important. And I think sometimes in society, especially women, when you age and you're older and you lose connection to people who can actually see you see you because they've known you since you were a child. It's important in terms of how healthy we are mentally, and how much people respect you because you bring that knowledge with you about the relationships you've had with people you've known your whole life. Even women who've married into my community, and seeing them grow and become grandparents, and seeing their children and their grandchildren. So those are blessings in the sense that I'm grateful for. But I chose to come home from living in the States. There was some urgency or some reasoning. I know my late mother needed help. But again, to stuff that I needed to heal from, I did make the effort. I have done the work. And as far as like people wondering who I am and trying to find out and learn from me, either you've done it appropriately or inappropriately. And for those who have done it appropriately, you will always be, as I put, wachashta washte, or just washte. So, it's important. Boundaries are important. Boundaries help us learn who we are and who the other person is. And it also helps us with our mission in this life. What is it here? What is it? Why are we here? And what is our purpose in this life? So as I've listened to different podcasts from different young influencers, it's important. So here's a topic that she wrote. She says, although we only make up 5% of the population, the 2014 National Task Force on Sex Trafficking and women and girls in Canada found that 51% of women and 50% of girls trafficked in Canada are Indigenous. Can you believe that? Even though we're the population, only 5% of the Canadian population, we make up 51 to 50% of people who are trafficked. And here's where it gets even more concerning. This is this young woman. 75% of Indigenous girls under the age of 18 experience sexual abuse, with 50% of those being under the age of 14. The extreme representation of Indigenous women in trafficking, sex trafficking, as well as the prevalence of gender violence points to a deep systemic problem. Now let's talk about the link between this and the foster care system. Now this is a young woman talking about this, and this is why, like for me, when it came to my niece, and when my brother was arrested and my nieces and nephews were put in the foster care system, I went to Chief and Council and I requested, because out of the 3, only 2 were nation members, on the ban list. Okay, that's why I'm talking about S2. When you're on the general ban list, like the other niece was on the general ban list, but she didn't belong to, she wasn't a voting member on any tribe in the Treaty 7 area, even though her mother was from Treaty 7. So that in itself, there was no representation from the community she was coming from, whereas the other 2 they were actually on the nation for Tsuut'ina. So my request to get them out of the foster care system in the city and transfer them to Tsuut'ina was, again, I could do that, but not for my niece, not for my other niece who was on the general ban list in Ottawa. So she says, so we know that the foster care system in Canada has a source of major issues when it comes to Indigenous people, especially in the broader context when we talk about harmful policies from the federal government. From residential schools, the 60s scoop, it is now just evolving through the modern-day child welfare system. That's why I'm saying we as Indigenous people need to take over the sovereignty of our child welfare systems, because it's policy from the provincial and federal government that we don't have a pot to piss in. And if we do, you have to be on the whichever Indigenous community you come from, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis community, that those leadership have a pot to piss in to get those children in their communities. That's how the system is structured. And again, too, if they've been in the foster care system or they've been apprehended in the cities, like I forget how many thousands, there's over 10,000 foster children in the tribe, like in one tribe in Treaty 7, that are in Calgary. And and again, there's throughout the country, when children, Indigenous children, again, like I said, 5%, and yet 50% or 51% are trafficked. And the average age is 14. And it's because, that's my opinion, and I'm adding to what this woman is saying, and she says, and because of that, it's leading into the root cause of these issues. For example, Indigenous children represent less than 8% of the Canadian population, but represent more than 50% of kids in care. Foster care systems is identified as a major pipeline to human trafficking, especially when it comes to kids that age out of care without any proper support that they need. See, Nietzsche Institute, that's NECHI Institute, had curriculum, had programs to help children who were going to be aged out of the foster care system. Like for decades, we've known there's been trafficking, right from the get-go when oil was discovered, and even then in residential school when those children were aged out at 15 or 16 from those institutions, they were given a bus ticket into Edmonton or Calgary. And who would be waiting at those bus stops? Pimps. So, the Indian Friendship Centers were created to help these children and to help people who were being victimized in those urban areas. Especially Regina was notorious as a child. Everybody knew that in Canada and still does, even non-Indigenous people. Now this young lady goes, which we see in the number of children that have gone missing. There is often a link between them and their experience in dealing with child protection agencies or the foster care system. And survivors of trafficking have pointed out the link between them and entering the system that actually deny dealing with poverty over abuse. So again, like the whole nature, yes, it was Indian residential schools, and in the 70s, the leadership said we needed to establish Nietzsche Institute. Now this, Sam Mareshi, who was appointed and was in cahoots and still is with Danielle Smith, as well as this leader of the Separatist Party and all this entourage of separatist people, like, hello, 250,000 signatures. Come on, people, get educated here. For decades and decades, Indigenous people we've been fighting to help heal our children and protect them. And then you get this woman elected into the province who shuts down all these programs that were fiduciary obligation from Ottawa, that because Ottawa is trying to make sure the province deals with it. And what does that province do? Especially Alberta wants to separate. Why? Because they don't want, they're trying to take the money, the very milk from Mother Earth's tit called oil and gas. Okay, so this woman says entering the system, then actually dealing with poverty over abuse. So she says she's got a map, and she shows of the disappearance of from 2010 to the present, and this map shows the outline of 3 major centers disappearing in the prairie provinces: Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Prince Albert, Regina, Saskatoon Triangle. So when we talk about the disappearance occurring in these 3 prairie provinces, it is very important to note that the prairie provinces encounter the top 4 provinces in terms of Indigenous population. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the statistics and how we actually dismantle this problem. But the emphasis on the foster care and child welfare system in general is so incredibly important because right now, First Nations across Canada are asserting their jurisdiction over Bill C-92, which gives the nation the capacity to actually manage their own children. Can you believe that? 2026, a Bill C-92 is identifying that we need to manage our own children and that we've been fighting to do this. And how many senators and how many House of Commons, like how much of this cycle we've been circling over and over again. Because what? We're a moneymaker? We're a moneymaker for foster parents, for psychologists, social workers that are non-Indigenous. Bless the hearts of those non-Indigenous social workers and therapists who actually give a shit. And for me, that's far and in between. That's why I advocate for our own people to, like Nietzsche Institute. And what did they do? They shut it down to try and privatize recovery centers, 11 in the province of Alberta. Who was the structure that created that? Indigenous people. And what do? Now they're passing it off as helping all other people under the privatization of the Alberta government. Like, get it. Realize it. When you talk about injustices, we know. We've been doing this since the closing of Indian residential schools. So this lady says that is why it is so incredibly important for that work to be treated delicately as a top priority. And people sitting at the table that not just have experience with child welfare system, but people with social work backgrounds, but also people that understand the data piece of it, because this is systemic. So when I talk about systemic racism and dismantling and understanding colonial ways of construct, that's what I'm talking about. There are more people like myself who understand the system because we've been living in it for decades since we were children, teenagers, getting an education. Now she goes on to say there are multiple moving parts there that need to be addressed, but this is concerning. Why are Native Americans called Indians? So again, Bill C-92, it's the complexity of it and how it has been dealt with because it's so systemic. Like I said, there are people like she says that the 60s Indigenous people, like I think in terms of just how people like farmers, ranchers, Indian sheep, like I don't know, what I'm trying to say is like it would be important that people understand where trafficking started and why it's so entrenched in our whole system that's set up by the federal and provincial governments. And that, just now we're getting this bill passed. How many decades? Like I said, 20 years ago, my niece fell through the cracks. The only way I could express my concern was through my blog. And even then, talking about trafficking, and nobody wanted to listen. Because historically, it's just taken for granted. This is, where are the laws protecting the women and children? And how is leadership responsible when they take that oath to protect the most vulnerable within the community? Their fiduciary obligation to the monies that come in and how it's being spent. It's important right now, even with Sutana and this lawsuit, because we're making this chief and council is making an effort to establish who is responsible and the fiduciary obligation of money that comes in. And this is trust money, as well as money from Sutana that generates from revenue. And these are concerns because this affects all Indigenous people, both in the United States and Canada. So even though you might just think, oh, it's an Alberta or Sutana thing, no. Everything and anything that happens within Indigenous people has a ripple effect throughout every part of Indian country, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, all of that. So yes, it's important to understand and to be advocate, especially if you don't live in an Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit community and you have a status card. It is important to be an advocate. And as much as you do, and the disparities of stepping on people's feet, the reality of how you have to deal with the systemic racism towards Indigenous women when you want to work with Indigenous people within First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. It's vital. And you're going to get criticized, you're going to get death threats, whatever. You're going to experience that. How and why do I know? Because I haven't gotten death threats, but I sure have had a lot of gossip that could have killed me, that could have really that have damaged my reputation and even my character. But yet I know who I am, and I know the people I've grown up with here in Tsuut'ina. And again, I don't think I could do this podcast without really, telling and having people understand that it's important to know who you are, to know your mission in life, and the purpose that you're here, whether or not people want to listen or deal with it or understand how I talk about certain things. And again, too, I'm pretty sure there are people who are listening to my podcast that are taking mental notes or actual notes and saying, oh, okay, I didn't know this, or yeah, I need to do that. But the reality of it is, life isn't easy. It's like I said, where would we be as women without men? And where would men be without women? So setting boundaries down and understanding the complexities of healthy human sexuality is vital to our very existence. We, like I've said before, we can't shut it off. It's not like a light switch. So we go through the process of understanding boundaries. And hopefully, whatever trauma or certain ways of thinking that makes you angry or resentful or just have emotional pain, it's important to feel that pain and to have a support system in place of people who will help you through that pain you're feeling. Again, that's why I continually admire the young women who, from the very young age at 15, having attended those Wawipi ceremonies and seeing the injustice done to, their friends, and how they've rallied for the past 20 years to understand themselves and others within their circle of friends, peers. It's so vitally important to have that because it's part of a collective, holistic way of healing and understanding what it is to be a healthy human sexual person. With boundaries, as much as I praise them, and I don't know if they know how I feel about them, I do put it on my podcast. And every once in a while I will say, to one of our leaders, we need to honor these young women. And again, too, when they're ready to be honored, it would be nice. But again, too, out of respect, you have to, understand their boundaries as well. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. I'm really grateful for all the things that I know about Europe, about the United States, about South America. I know there are so many other things that I keep on learning about, and hopefully, as I understand and try to make it a point of what is a pretendian and what isn't, and why is it important for people to understand, that you're doing a disservice by pretending that you've lived this experience when you haven't. Or pretend that you're living it today when you really haven't. So if I offend people that way and you think that you were good friends with me, I see you. And what can I say? Actions speak louder than words, and my whole life I've known so many white people. I don't chase after white people. I was talking to my cousin. I said, you know, this is the whole point. You just don't chase after people for attention. I know when I see that, I know that it's stepping the boundaries of people. It's crossing those boundaries, and that's why in my earlier podcasts about Nathan chasing horse and limerence, the infatuation or the moment that infatuation turns into limerence. See, a lot of people who believe they have this keynote or this theory or this understanding of limerence, you're welcome to your own interpretation of how you see it and how you need to eliminate it or what it means to be in limerence. And for me, it's a little different than when I say establishing boundaries, because a lot of times when people are attracted to people and they have this sexual arousal, they project it onto the individual as if that individual is that love connection. But the reality of it is, the critical thinking is, the individual isn't the person, it's the person who you have memory of. So the more you focus on the original sexual arousal of this feeling, the sexual feeling that you have, isn't on the person you're in limerence with. So even though you feel that, it's not real. And the more you know that, and the more boundaries are put in place, the better off your relationship is with the person that you're attracted to. Because limerence sort of buggers everything up, bastardizes everything, because you don't have the capacity to separate illusion, delusion, or even in terms of trying to find purpose in your life. I just hope that I get to meet older white women who do have the capacity to put boundaries down. Like that, for me, that's a critical statement. That's a critical statement, because I do truly believe that Daniel Smith is incapable of having boundaries, especially with men who don't have boundaries as well. That's just my personal opinion, and I know some women wouldn't want to even be put in the same category as her, but the reality of it is, yes, there are complexities when it comes to boundaries, and with that, I hope women and men can understand and respect each other when it comes to those boundaries. So I hope my podcast isn't as boring as like I would have thought it would be, but I'm going to publish this, and we'll see how that goes. And I don't want to change anything of this podcast. I just wanted to put that out there, so there's a little history to these statistics that are out there when it comes to the way Indigenous women are seen